So welcome everybody to our IXDA Chicago April event. My name is Lon Taylor from First Insights. And if you haven't joined us before, thank you so much for joining. If you are a regular participant, thanks for coming again. We really appreciate it. I usually start off with just a couple of slides to let everyone know our agenda and some other events. So just to have some webinar ground rules or suggestions, please turn off your audio if you are not a speaker or presenter, and turn off your video as well. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. And if you do have a question, feel free to use the chat feature to connect with folks and present a question. Remember, we are recording the event, so we appreciate everyone participating and following the basic ground rules. So tonight's event, just to set us up, is designing the ideal client and partner collaboration. We have folks from Flexera, which is based a little bit outside of Chicago in Itasca, and then IA Collaborative, which is right in Chicago. We're all working remotely, so there are obviously people all around the US and some folks who might be from overseas as well. And I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves at the end of my quick slideshow here. But just some other events that are going on. We always like to promote our fellow UX and creative communities. This looks like a really interesting event. It's decolonizing design from a Latinx perspective. I did not know this, that only only 3% of Latinx folks are working in tech in the US. That is an interesting number. It really is way too low given the population. So this is a discussion of that topic, which I think is probably really interesting. The UX Book Club, Designing for Emotion, second edition. I think this is a follow-up discussion on Aaron Walter's book, and that is Wednesday, April 21st. The Chicago Lean Startup Circle. This is more related to small businesses, and I know there are certainly some folks on this call who are small businesses or maybe independent contractors. SEO basics for small business. It's great if you're trying to promote yourself in the market out there. So that is Thursday, April 22nd. Some other IXDA events, which are open pretty much to everybody via Meetup. So IXDA Houston, Women in UX Leadership Panel is April 22nd. The IXDA Atlanta is presenting Mentor Mania, which sounds great. If anyone is a student or recent grad, that is probably a really fun event to go to and productive as well, as is the IXDA Charlotte event, which is Resume and Portfolio Review Workshop, which is May 14th. Join us, communicate, send us ideas. We'd love to have you present, set up a panel discussion. Any ideas are welcome. And one of the things also is, these events, we've started to obviously record the events, and some past events, there's 3 or 4 events that are on YouTube. Our last event from, I think it was 2 weeks ago, with GE Healthcare will go up on our YouTube channel very shortly. If you didn't see that, it's a great presentation on a design system that was created by GE Healthcare. These are your IXDA local leaders. Again, reach out to any of us with any questions. We'd love to have additional participation and panel discussions, presentations, anything that is an idea that you have, get in touch. So tonight's event, designing the ideal client-partner collaboration. I think this is a great topic because I've seen great projects where there's lots of success. I've also seen, because I've been around a long time and have done this for a while, projects that go off the rails. And it's due to a variety of things. It could be, missed expectations, poor communication. So our discussion tonight is really going to be focused on how to succeed. What worked from a recent project with Flexera and IA Collaborative. And with that, I am going to pass it off to Niketa, who is going to present. And also, we might want to just introduce everybody at the beginning of our discussion. So Niketa, feel free to introduce yourself and the Flexera team. And then Jeff, you can feel free to just jump in and introduce yourself and the IA Collaborative team.
You got it, Lon. Thank you so much for having us here. I'm presenting at the second event at IXDA. The last one was a lot of fun. Thanks, Lon, for having us. I'm Niketa Jhaveri, and I am, sorry, it's asking me to share my screen. Okay. All right, it's sharing.
Great.
You can see it. Okay. I'm Niketa Jhaveri. I head up the user experience team at Flexera. With me, I have two of my team members here. Ian Parham, who is a senior manager of interaction design, waving his hand here, and Ashley Rossiaky. I'm gonna always mess your last name, Ashley. She's a senior interaction designer on my team, and they help me execute this project from start to finish. So I thought that bringing them on here on the panel would help you get the perspective from not only from leadership side, but also from execution side of things. Jeff, on to you.
Sure. I'm Jeff Gershune. I'm the Research and Strategy Group Director for IA Collaborative. And with me, as well as a few of the folks from the team who left the project. So Hyun Kim, he's our Group Director for UX. We've got Bryan Flavin, who's a principal within our UX team. And then Sarah Ekblad, who's an Associate Director within Research and Design Strategy as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. So let's get started about the discussion of how to design ideal client and partner collaboration. So when we started this project, I joined Flexera about 11 months back. When we started this project, our objective overall was to create a unified North Star for Flexera One, which is not only based on the collective expertise we had within the organization, but also with some of the partners and customers. So the reason for us to kind of go outside and get some help from the creative agencies is to make sure that we have full staffed for not only for the researchers and designers, but also kind of get some out of the box thinking for us, right? So to get internal team motivated to learn more from external on what's going on for other SaaS companies, how they're doing it, how they're executing the project. So that was our vision. So they were kind of, while Flexera One and creating a North Star was definitely a #1 vision for us, but also there were other objectives we wanted to get at. So, and we'll talk about those objectives and how we met them in the later slides. So we evaluated 3 different agencies, and what made us choose IA Collaborative was their ability to understand our needs right away. So they came to us with their first presentation, completely off the marks. They thought we want the marketing stuff, right? We didn't want the marketing stuff, but Ian and I quickly explained to them what our needs are and how we want to see some of these projects executed. So without any slides, this was actually a really important moment there, because without any slides, what they did is they just told us exactly what we're looking for and how they would execute that. So that to us was, Ian and I were like, oh, okay, this sounds like they understood with what we're looking for. So that sounded like a more good sign of people's capabilities. They understood us right, and of course, trust was a big factor in there. Jeff, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think for us it was, I think that was also a pivotal moment as well. I think from both sides, you're always looking for a collaboration for one. I think everyone talks about collaboration, but usually that can easily be weighted towards one side or the other. And the thing that really, I think, represents that is that open communication, that ability to work agile in the moment back and forth, because that has established that trust and communication. And that was from the very beginning of the entire project. Even from the scoping side of things, when we were still being evaluated with others. At the same time, we look for that on our side as we're evaluating partners too. So for us, it was a pivotal moment also as we could work together to define the intent and outcome of what we wanted. And if you can do that in the beginning, you know that'll last throughout the whole project as well. Other things that I think that were really important that were done here was, you obviously have to establish trust, and that was up the ladder in a couple of different levels. So one, us with the Flexera team, the folks that you're seeing on the call today, and what that collaboration is going to look like. But also, obviously, there's a ton of stakeholders within the organization, and they're putting out a lot of energy and effort and resources towards this. So how do you build that trust and alignment around where the project's going to go, right? So we worked a lot together to put that, I hate to use the word, but like that argument, that discussion, that proof out there. So we wanted to visualize the process that we were going to go through. We wanted to provide structure in order to say how we were going to get there. So what you see even on the slide here is this establishing behavioral-based ROI. So using things like the 7 elements of innovation, showing that we'll be looking at things that are desirable, viable, and possible, aligning that you can't really see on here around like, well, what are the goals that we have as a project and the value we're going to bring to our customers, and then talking about what is going to be the return on this investment. How is design, right? Everything that all of us on this call today need to strive for. What's the ROI on the design? Because it can be very intangible. So how do we make that more concrete? So we worked as a group together to present content forward that Niketa could share with the stakeholders to provide that trust and gain alignment and to open up those avenues of collaboration and kind of ground this in this behavioral-based design process.
Yeah, and I'll have to tell you that this project, while I was presenting it to us, I had to go and present that business case to the CEO. So I'm asked from leadership standpoint, give me the ROI if you really want to hire this agency. So must say that IA made this easy for me because they kind of gave me some ROIs, and then I added my own and presented to the CEO and made sure that we are seeing all of this in the light of business objectives as well as the UX objective, and that's what at the end of the day how we actually won the business case to actually bring in the company into the fold. These are kind of high-level project objectives we had. So we wanted to explore the ways to integrate siloed product experiences into one. We wanted to unlock cross-sell and upsell, right? Every SaaS application wants to have a cross-sell and upsell kind of opportunities. Wanted to validate and discover top priorities and objectives of the users. And for the next, not only just like upcoming release, but also for the next 3 years, right? And establish what we know, what we can't do now, but we want to do in future. So kind of gap analysis, some of the use cases which we never thought of, what would those be? So we are asking IA to do impossible, which is, that is what we don't know, right? And they are like, if you haven't figured it out yet, I don't know how I would, but they did. So we'll get into that a little bit later. And then refining and creating personas. I'm not kidding, Ashley, we'll go in details here, but we had 40 different personas. So how do you consolidate these personas into one, and how do you kind of represent that and redesign a persona into the organization and push it forward? Refine and create use cases that will bring impact for our users. And that was obviously the North Star. What are the use cases we want to establish? Yeah, this one.
And then just to give everybody a kind of a quick understanding of the project itself, this was essentially a 3-month journey to develop these user-generated concepts. And there was a few activities that we did that would create a foundation for us even before and really the goal was to get mixed inputs and also to make sure that we were inclusive of everyone in the organization, so that it's not just about this team working well together, but to make sure that not that people have buy-in, but they feel like they're participating, or really not feel like they are participating in the development of these. And so the inclusivity of extended team members happened at all 3 of these phases. So even just in this first phase, doing just stakeholder interviews, current state reviews, and working with the teams in order to get product demos. So we incorporated a whole collaboration across the organization to come in and be part of this process the whole way through. Really, we're the orchestrators of this, and it's about inclusivity. So when we say collaboration, we really mean it on like the biggest C kind of level, like collaboration across the organization. And then within the user research itself, which we'll talk more about, even giving people the opportunity within the organization to join those sessions. And then again, collaboration involved stakeholders and end users, with meaning like the customers within Flexera as well. So making sure they were part of the collaboration. And then in phase 3, when we were getting into the generative kind of 1 + 1 = 3 workshops and the design concepts, again, opening that back up to the organization to bring them all in to be inclusive of the concepts. So for us as a group, collaboration was much more than just the 7 or 8 people that you see on this screen, but really tens of people throughout the whole organization and external as well.
And just to give you the magnitude of people collaboration, so about 23 participants, as you see, customers and partners, but internal folks, we had about 50 to 60 people internally collaborating with us, and that was quite amazing just to have orchestrate this in 3 months, 70 people, and getting feedback, bringing that feedback into the fold, designing behind and after that feedback, and then illustrating the North Star was quite an endeavor, and which was done nicely. Ian?
Off mute here. Hey, so part of getting this off the ground was really just integrating that team as almost like new hires into the organization, right? And so what we did is we brought the IA folks in actually onto our systems like Teams and Confluence and Jira, et cetera. And so basically they became an ingrained part of the team. And while this was a distinct project going on the side, part of the benefit of bringing them in was to have this focus on that project while we had our normal run rate of things going across the organization. The end result is that we basically had no gap between knowing who's working on what and where the status of the overall project is, and communication became a lot easier that way as well. I mean, we'll talk a little more about that later, but the idea was to have them give them access to all the same resources we have so that they can work without any hands tied behind their back. How about you, Hyun?
Yeah, totally agree with that, Ian. So, I mean, technically speaking, so we work across, so speaking from the agency side, depending on the clients that we worked with, some of them was kind of very separate, where you almost have to go through a middleman for everything that you want to do. So, for example, file sharing, it's really hard to even send over a large graphic file over to them or things like that. And there's a lot of challenges, but I think in this engagement, that technical integration that we were able to be in your environments fully just made things so much easier. So, with communications, we're able to just immediately chat with whoever we needed to, scheduling meetings. I know that sounds really trivial, but just be able to see other people's calendars. And as Niketa mentioned, there were like 70, 80 people that we were coordinating with. So to be able to see everyone's calendar, just directly do things, having a single source of truth, being able to collaborate on cloud documents together, that just really made the project, that technical, that really low, and just enables you to just focus on the work and less about how to administratively manage the work. So I think it was a huge benefit for the project. And as in-house people or agency folks, as you're looking to bring on partner, I think that's, if as much as possible, if you can provide that access into your environment, that's hugely helpful. Another note that I'll say is not just technically speaking or environment, but also just organizationally. We were introduced as part of Flexera's UX team from the get-go. And again, a lot of times in other engagements we have, it's like, this is our consultant, this is our design innovation agency. And there's kind of like this middleman that you have to always kind of work with. But with Flexera in this engagement, from the start, we were positioned as part of the Flexera UX team. We had Flexera email addresses. All of our deliverables use Flexera templates. Even as we worked together on presentations, we co-presented the work together. It was, lots of times, like when it goes to presentations and things like that, clients are kind of, I tend to see they're a little bit reluctant to want to present. But the team at Niketa's team, they were just diving right in. We would just go ahead and present the work. So from a stakeholder perspective, like you really couldn't tell who was on the Flexera team and who was from IA Collaborative. So, I think one of the biggest benefits overall is that it's about collaboration, and we were able to just work with not necessarily the core team, but the extended team, as well as everybody throughout the organization pretty much seamlessly and with as low friction as possible because we had access. We're part of the organization. I think there were definitely there's obviously some pain points. Nothing's perfect. Like we had 2 email addresses, we had 2 calendars that you had to manage, things like that. But really, those are minor and compared to kind of the benefits. And I'd probably say the most difficult piece was we work in Keynote and Flexera works in PowerPoint. So that was probably the biggest pain point of all, just being able to work in PowerPoint, which is on our side, it was really just hard. It was, even just to like put a drop shadow on something, it probably took me like 3 minutes to figure that out. But other than that, it was a really good experience of being onboarded together and working in the same environment.
Yeah, just to hammer on that a little bit, one of the benefits of them being in our environment, working with our tools is at the end of the day, you normally have like a dump of slideware and assets at the end of a project like this from the vendor, and for us, it's already all there in the way we already organize our content, right? So on a regular basis, we actually are able to refer back to the product of this effort and integrate it into our day-to-day, right? Which was the overall goal of the project, was to have something that we could use going forward. And this just, I think, has paid dividends in that regard. So moving on to the next slide here, frequent and successful communication. So I worked with, Hyun and Bryan on this one on a daily basis. Also some people from our team like Ashley. We ended up having a daily stand-up, again, sort of driving home that whole like part of the team aspect. So, on our side, initially it was like exposing them all the resources they need to know and making sure that on a day-to-day question, they have all those answers, and then setting them up with the right people. And so, essentially we were able to unblock every day as needed in order to keep them moving. And I'm sure Bryan has something to add as well.
Yeah, I think coming from the agency side, you're always stepping into a new project with a entirely new cadence for how you're handling communication, and figuring out what the right cadence for that project and for the team you're working with. It's a fine nuance in exactly how you're going to be working with a team for the rest of that project. And I think we were able to do that incredibly successfully with Flexera, in that they really leaned towards and we did a great job working to have a much more frequent, cadence of communication back and forth between IA and Flexera, to the point where, we were essentially entrenched teams, not separate teams. I think typically in the agency side, you're looking at, either that style, which in this case worked out perfectly, or looking at something where it's less frequent. And there's definitely going to be pros and cons to either. But when we're looking at the more frequent communication, you just gain so much efficiency in being able to collaborate with the partners you're working with on a day-to-day basis. It gives you more opportunity to actually align on, the day-to-day needs. Some of the specific things you kind of have to make sure that both parties are comfortable with is like with that more frequent communication. Of course, there's almost this letting down of your guard to have like less polished client communication than you might have if you're only speaking once a week, which just for personal flavor, I greatly prefer, because it just creates a much more open form of communication and you get to solutions much quicker. I think the only thing, to really make sure you are super clear about is setting expectations for I know we're talking every day, but it's going to take me 3 days to do this. And so let's set up a meeting to touch base on that. So really setting those clear expectations is something I think we did very successfully, because we had open communication. If there was a problem, if there was a deadline that we needed to, flex on or anything like that, we could be super clear about it. And then also just from an agency side, and also the nature of this project, we're often working in some form of ambiguity, and being able to be clear about those ambiguities as, as nonsensical as that kind of sounds, I think is super helpful when you're really trying to figure out the things that you're solving while you're working on it. And so that frequent communication allows you more flexibility to pivot or address to new needs or challenges that are kind of coming up through the actual working process. So you can kind of adjust and shift as things are moving through. And it's that frequent communication that really enables that kind of working mentality.
Yeah, I mean, just to again layer on top there. I mean, a lot of it comes down to trust, right? So half of the time it's the personalities involved anyway. So a good bunch of folks here between IA and UX and Flexera's UX team. And so because we have that trust, there's like the ambiguity is okay, right? We know we're trying to find out what some of the questions are half the time, and nobody has to feel like they have the answer. So we have a lot of open and honest conversations about, well, I don't know, let's find out, and that's totally fine and way more productive in a situation like this. So anyway, hat tip to the folks who are involved.
All right, so getting an agency up to speed on the current state of products and domain knowledge. This was an interesting one, right? Because we kind of had to get together and say what content would be helpful for IA Collaborative to go through. In some regard, you want to give them as much as possible so that they can learn as much as possible. But in another regard, there really is only so much content that they can go through, right? There's only so much time. So we don't want to inundate them with content. So, what we did was, sorry about the camera, my internet's being a little funky, so it's kind of going in and out. But what we did was, part of what Ian and Hyun talked about was getting them set up in our environment. And so some of you on the call are probably familiar with Confluence, right? And we used Confluence to store all of this information so that they weren't fully reliant on us or our schedules, and they could reference the material anytime they needed. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't go through it with them, right? Because giving them that introduction of the content was also really important, so that they weren't just kind of poking through it on their own. They needed a little context from us, but it allowed them to reference it down the road. Some of the materials that we gathered, just for some perspective on that, Niketa mentioned personas. So we went and gathered the 40-some personas that we had. Part of why we had so many personas was because just the different teams would go and create their personas to work with. And part of this Flexera One effort was to unify those. And so that's part of what we did, but they needed the reference of all the ones from different areas of the product to be able to see what would play into the unification. Other things that we provided were market segmentation information. So how do we present ourselves to the market? How are we perceived in the market by analysts like Gartner, right? All of this helped build that background for IA Collaborative. Some product training videos so they could understand our current products, competitive landscape. So what competitors do we see most? Who do we face most in the market? What parts of the portfolio does each competitor cross? So we have several areas in our products, right? Whether it's cloud or IT assets or something like that. Where is this competitor applicable? How does the market see our competitors, right? It's one thing to understand how the market sees us, but the competitors are important too. And then demos and screenshots where we could find them from competitors. We also gave them our design system and brand documentation so they could understand what we already have and how marketing wants our brand to be represented, because that's just as important. An acronym guide, because Flexera has a lot of acronyms, and so that would be an easy, quick reference for them. It makes conversations difficult for newcomers, right? So they caught on quickly, to be fair to them, but when you have so many acronyms, you need a reference for that. We also provided the current state and vision set by Flexera's leadership team, so that they could understand and try to align to that in the work that they were doing with us. Another one was our org structure, right? So it was helpful for them to understand how Flexera operates and who outside of the core team might be helpful for them to work with or interview when we got to stakeholder interviews. And then we did a review ourselves of our current products so that they know where we stood on our products and what areas we already knew needed some focus. I know that was a lot. Bryan, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge coverage of just the materials that we were given. But I think what I would emphasize on that is, it wasn't just a handing over materials over a fence, which you can often see. Essentially, it was a very guided tour through a lot of these materials. And I think that is, where stepping into a space like IT asset management, which maybe for a lot of people here is super obvious and, common language. It wasn't for me stepping into it. So, it is a bit like going back to school in a sense, where you first need to start digging into the very basics of what the space and industry and domain actually are. And I mean, personally, I started by going down a pretty in-depth YouTube wormhole where I was just taking like the basics of ITAM and trying to just make sense of like what at the core basis is happening here. And I think Flexera, were fantastic partners for this, because whether they thought it or not, they never let the ignorance that we might have stepped into it with really show, and we're really there to help teach, help us, along. Because in the end, that quick onboarding is going to be mutually beneficial, and there's not a lot gained in essentially pretending to have a domain expertise where, like, I'm never going to outsmart the Flexera team and say something about IT asset management that they don't understand. So, it's better to take a bit more advantage of, their expertise and ask questions and be that annoying person in every meeting who is just like, I'm going to have you say that one more time. I'm then going to say it back to you, and you tell me if I actually got it right, which I did to an excruciating degree throughout this project, I'm sure. But I think it's really, at least from an agency perspective, one of the more challenging but also interesting things that you get when you take on a very difficult or complex space like asset management. And being able to work with the Flexera team and set clear expectations about where we had gaps in our knowledge and where they could work with us to fill those was super helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, Bryan, like, our domain is really different. You have to spend a lot of time in it to understand it, right? And so I worked at Flexera for 3.5 years roughly, and there's still things that I'm learning every day. Overall, I have a pretty general picture of it, but depending what you're working on, you're still going to have to dig in really deeply to get a good knowledge of what you're working on.
Yeah.
And to the other end of that, right, having IA Collaborative as a partner that didn't have as deep domain knowledge came in beneficial sometimes too, right? Because it was easier for them to not know than it was for Niketa, Ian, or myself to not know. And so they could ask questions for us that maybe wouldn't have been received as well if we had asked, right? Because they're expected to not know. And so it's beneficial in some ways as well.
Yeah. It also, oh, go on, Bryan.
No, I was just going to point out, like, that's an interesting point, Ashley. I remember it was maybe the first or second week of the project, one of the large chunks of information we really dug our teeth into were some of the initial product walkthroughs, which thankfully we recorded because we went through 6 or so of them in that first week. And, it was immensely helpful then. But then I came back maybe 4 weeks later when we, had a better sense of the use cases, and I started trying to match it to the products. I rewatched all of those recordings, and like, it was so surprising. Like, just looking back through it, I was like, wow, I didn't get that the first time. I didn't get this the first time. And like, the just building of knowledge on top of it, I could see how you could essentially do that for an entire career, let alone just a short project.
Yeah.
I'd also add in that, you talk about coming in with a set of naive eyes and that being a benefit. It also allows both our team and the Flexera team to ask why, in the sense of like, why have we done it this way versus another, and give that opportunity to assess each move that's been made in the past. and kind of challenge that to see, one, explain what are the rationale behind it, and is there opportunity to improve, shift, or change that for better in the future.
Yeah.
One more tip I would give here is that we gave probably 600 to 800 hours worth of recording to them to say, oh, we have all of this research, figured it out, what the use cases we need to actually focus on. And I know, Ian, I think you used one of the tools to transcribe all the recordings into the actual format. That helped IA to swift through some of the more important content very quickly. So that's kind of one of the tip, and just want to throw it out there that if you have a ton of recording, the best way to get through that would be transcribe it to using a tool and then review them.
Yeah, transcripts would let them search for keywords and things. I don't know if they did, right? But that would be a benefit to the transcripts, is searching for keywords.
Yep. So moving on to creating a shared understanding of the future state, right? I love how Bryan talked about working in ambiguity, and that's the whole project was about creating a North Star. We don't know what we want and we need to get there. So it's one thing to create bullet points of vision saying, oh yeah, we want this, but it's another to articulate that vision to an agency who actually do not have the domain knowledge and has to convert that into full-blown deliverables, that too with very limited time and budget, right? So we of course had a limited budget, and we will consistently talk about how we can do this in the timely manner. So the challenge we had with the future state was, of course, ambiguous unknown of how we want to shape Flexera's North Star. What we want to know, what we don't know already. We had to make sure that we clarified, articulated, and refined our needs of the vision to IA in the best way we could, and then have them run with it. Thus, giving them access to our customers, our resources, internal stakeholders was the best thing we could do to remove all the barriers in their way. And in addition, I had the vision of what the end state would look like, which was bringing all this research and like all the North Star and everything into one presentation. Like that was my kind of one thing I had set up from the beginning, that I want one presentation which I can reference to anytime in the future, and we can create that as a final deliverable. I think at the time when I said that vision sounded very ambitious at the point at the time, because it's like, no, one presentation is not going to cover everything because we have so much we need to be doing, but I think it came out really nicely. I think overall, the quality of the presentation, the quality of the deliverables to me was more important than the quantity of the deliverable. So there were a ton of quantity given, but it came with quality because the research was so thorough, the designs were so thorough, everything was collaborated, domain experts were consulted. So, and even today, 3 months it's been, we refer to that project and we refer to the research, we refer to saying, hey, okay, we need to pull this in. And I'll talk a little bit later on about how we converted that into our roadmap. So we'll talk about that later. Hyun, you want to add something?
Yeah. So, we're trying to figure out the shared vision of the future. If part of it is just on the agency side, understanding it for the future state for ourselves, even before we worry about how we're going to share that vision out. And one thing that helps with that, I think it just, as we stated before, in terms of onboarding with domain knowledge, something it just takes a little bit of time to marinate and immerse, and kind of you keep going back to the same things over and over, and you learn more. So definitely, I think there's nothing getting around that. Like it just takes a little bit of time. So if you're on the agency side, there might be some pressure of there's a really tight timeline and you need to kind of ramp up really quickly and figure out what this vision is, but just kind of allowing yourself to have the liberty to, you might not figure it out right away, but you're going to start building towards that. So that was one important thing. The other one is just getting a lot of different perspectives. Hearing it from one person is entirely different. We'll get a different perspective from somebody else. So the stakeholder interviews are really interesting, right? Just hearing different perspectives that people had within the company of what they think the future vision is. And you're just starting to hear all these different tidbits, and then you start triangulating it for yourself. Another thing that's really helpful for understanding that future vision is understanding that larger business context, like what is the business priorities, what are the other things that are in play, and then how does this project that you're working on fit into that larger strategy. So being able to sit in on internal meetings or looking at larger strategy docs really gives you a good idea of what you're trying to achieve. I think like small anecdotes also really help. So Niketa mentioned one time during the project that when she joined Flexera, one of her big missions was just to fill the product pipeline, right? We need to know what we need to do, and that kind of gave me a little bit more insight as to, okay, the final deliverable and the vision also needs to kind of help in this area. So you're just triangulating all these different inputs, what the company is doing, and anecdotes that really helps you kind of figure out what this future state that you're after. In terms of communicating out future vision and your strategies and with a large organization, I think terminology is really important. As you guys know, all the different the companies that you work at, you all have your own set of acronyms and your terminology. And on the agency side, it's really important to just know what those things are and start adopting that language. And even over time, it might change. In the beginning of the project, we were calling kind of our North Star the art of possible. And we were kind of using that across all our communication. But as the project went, that terminology changed and it became 1 + 1 = 3, right? So making sure that you're in sync with the terminology. Probably another one was just, we didn't work in a black box. So I think because we're working on it collaboratively, we were able to share that vision much more easily. Like you didn't even have to share it by the end because everybody knew what it was. And then I think Niketa alluded to this as well, is that having some tangible, concrete examples of what we're shooting for was really, really helpful. She brought in kind of artifacts that she was kind of envisioning what would this presentation look like, and just having something in detail as opposed to something being kind of hypothetical really helps kind of narrow in on what we want that future vision to be.
Yeah, so how did we get it all done, right? And at the beginning, we had a lot of conversations about what we wanted to achieve, what we wanted to demonstrate as far as ROI at the end of the day. But there's a lot of steps to get from here to there, right? And so this is another area where integrating them or treating them like an extension of the team, not just in terms of interactions, but also in terms of technology. So we were able to set up a board where we could track all the deliverables and treat each milestone as a release. So we didn't necessarily work that like you would a Kanban board every day, but you would look at it and say, I know pretty much at any time exactly where we are in the journey toward getting this project complete. And then the other thing is that within each of these milestones, there's a lot of sort of mini projects that you have to achieve to get done, whether it's booking research sessions either with internal or external stakeholders, or it's getting ready for the workshop that we had in the final phase, which was not an insignificant undertaking. We basically built out 6 teams for some rapid prototyping over the course of a week. And all of that, it takes lead time and visibility and understanding. And so we basically were able to stake out each piece of the puzzle to get from A to Z, and then track that along the way. And and Hyun was kind of my partner in crime here, and really was proactive about keeping the ball rolling from the IA side, and really helped step up and do some organization, even some organization on our side on occasion. So thank you there. But overall, we managed to get this whole thing going, and that was even with holidays in the middle and delays and whatnot like that. But so far, pretty happy with how that all turned out. Over to you, Hyun.
Yeah. So I think what was really important for us in making sure that we were on track with the project and delivering on time and according to our plan is actually not following the script to the T. We all have ideas of how this project's going to play out in the beginning, but every project, there's curveballs, pivots that you have to make, things that you don't anticipate. So really having the mindset of flexibility and being open to changing course if you need to. I think the biggest thing that helps with that is just figuring out what are the key milestones and being more objectives oriented. So by this milestone, what is it that we're really trying to accomplish and why? And if you're just tracking towards more of the objective, you get less mired down in the details of like, oh, we got to do this activity and that activity, and you can really focus on providing high value activities, right? So in certain examples, we said, okay, by this so-and-so time, we need to do a UX review in competitive, right? That was on the plan. But when we looked at where we were in the project, we were really trying to accomplish something else. And those deliverables necessarily didn't make sense at that point in time. So we were able to have that conversation to say, hey, our objective is this. Maybe we should focus instead on doing these types of activities to get this level of value. And maybe we can shift those activities to later on, or maybe even, do we even need those deliverables anymore, right? So being able to just be a little bit more goals oriented and, being very open to changing flexibility, changing deliverables, changing sequencing. And I think at the end of the day, that's what really helped us keep on track, because this was I mean, it was 3-4 months, but it was really fast and furious. So I think that was really essential to how we were able to manage the project.
Just to add to that, for me, as I'm looking at the project and sponsoring it, and I'm hearing, we are not going to deliver that, we'll deliver that later on, was kind of like question mark on my face, because like, wait, we need to do that. But then at the end of the day, it's about trusting the team and trusting IA, choose like, they know what they're doing. I'm going to trust them to say, okay, they're going to deliver it at the end of the project. They're going to, the sequence we have decided before may not work in the situation what we had. They just work later on. So just have to trust them to do what they were going to do, and they came through. Right? So that's important.
So recruiting is always a bit of a challenge for people. It's just, it has to be highly coordinated, right? So one of the things that really helped us with recruiting was a spreadsheet that Sarah created, and she might have had to drop by now. I know she had a conflict, but this was critical for us. It became our Bible, and keeping it up to date was vital. So it contained the master list of everyone that we reached out to, if they accepted or declined, if they passed the screener. And then we had a separate tab for our screen participants and their responses to the screener questions, so that we could see their responses and reference that before their sessions. And then it also had their scheduling status, so we knew who was scheduled and who still needed to be scheduled. Of course, we also had a moderator guide and some stimuli for the workshop, right? That's nothing too out of the ordinary for research. But it was crucial that Flexera went through the moderator guide with a fine-tooth comb, so that when Sarah was doing the sessions for us, she looked like an expert, right? If there was maybe a term that was wrong or something like that, that kind of diminishes and puts the research at risk. So that was really important. We also did a test session with an actual participant to work out any issues that there may have been. And one of the reasons that we use an actual participant, actually there's a few now that I'm thinking about it. One was because if it went well, then we could use that data, right? The other reason was because some of the participants, sometimes you get the data that you have and the screener information that you have, and maybe it's not an exact match to what you're looking for, but it was pretty close, right? And so again, if we felt the data we got aligned with our personas, then we could have used that. And so using an actual participant instead of just kind of running with ourselves was really beneficial in that way. For the actual research sessions, Sarah was our primary moderator, but something that helped her was a backup moderator. So in most cases, I think it was Ian or myself, right? And we kind of split between, okay, this persona kind of covers this area of the domain, and Ian has more knowledge there, so he'll be the backup moderator there. And this one covers this area and actually has some more knowledge there, so she'll cover that. And that kind of gave Sarah some breathing room to allow us to ask some follow-up questions where needed, or respond to participant questions as well. So from Sarah's perspective, she mentioned to us that that was really unique and beneficial to her. Something else that came up was that we had a back channel for chatting, and that was helpful too, because that gave our participants the option to send Sarah questions as we were in the session, and so Sarah could ask questions if she had the time available. And the last thing that was really beneficial that I think is relatively common in research again, but as a reminder, was debriefs after each session, right? This allowed us to give Sarah some feedback, or it allowed Sarah to ask some questions like, how do you think this went? Do you think we could adjust this, and get immediate feedback so that we could make each session a little bit better?
And then just some additional things that Sarah had taken notes that we discussed on was, one, I think what was key is a lot of the time when we talk about collaborating with our partners to do recruiting, that generally takes, it can take more effort than less, because you're having like all these different people to go through. And the fact that Ashley was a dedicated resource to help recruit, and there was one kind of truth or source of communication and ownership to that, was key. And it wound up being more efficient in this sense because we had one person that you could go to. And because she had relationships with the people within the organization, she could reach out and help expedite those conversations more directly. And that way kind of put pressure on where she needed, and or be agile to go off to another or a next person to get that information or that contact. Since we were talking with actual customers at this time, we wanted to make sure we had that direct connection and get them as fast and efficiently as possible. She was able to reach out to people within the organization, and she really was that funnel, and that way she helped us to track folks down into that kind of like efficient pipeline. Also, because sessions were unpaid, this can make recruiting harder, so we really had to lean on those connections within the organization to help us kind of incite and instigate and incentivize these folks to participate with us so that they could see that value. And so really putting together kind of a summation in an email and giving them those talking points to make that argument for us so that our customers would see value in participating was key as well. And that came down to things like templated emails and configuration, things that everyone could use as a speaking guide going up. And then obviously you're aiming for certain individuals within the organization. Like we said, we had all these personas and we wanted to make sure we were hitting that spectrum. And so sometimes you're getting at only one level and you want to go a level up. So what we wanted to do was then empower the people we had recruited to start to encourage and invite others within their organization to come as well. And so that kind of co-participation got us an extended group of people. Plus, it removed the burden of one person's perspective and benefited us from getting multiple people's perspectives in there as well also. I think Ashley mentioned a lot about the moderation of the sessions. Another thing I would add in there was we moderated the sessions in Figma, and that way it allowed us to do a couple of things. It had all of our content in one space and it visualized what we were talking about and discussing when we weren't screen sharing, and it made almost like a central place for us all to work on. And it also allowed us to take notes in that space as well too. So you had one-to-one relationship between the content that you were sharing, the things you were talking about, and the feedback and the direction you were getting from everyone, all in one central location. And obviously you could then make separate pages for each person, but it allowed us to keep, essentially, because we were virtually, it was our virtual project room when it came to research in the end. And then I'd say the last pieces I'd put in there was, you're always wondering, like, how did research go? It was beneficial to us, but hopefully these people, the kind of co-researchers that we had in this, our customers, our participants, felt that as well too. And it was nice that we noticed that our participants expected, they wanted this feedback loop and they were excited about it. And they wanted to know more about the outcomes of the research. So they're excited to see what this, what comes out of the project and participate in those next evolutions, those generations. So for us, it's always nice when we get requests to hear recordings of the research sessions, because they felt like it was not just helpful to us, but helpful for them as well. They wanted to remember what they said because it was insightful for them, for their own organization. So for us, that's a success when we're not just learning, but in the instant they have already seen it as a benefit to them just by participating in the work, which makes recruiting next time when we want to put stuff out in front of them a whole lot easier.
Yeah, and just to build off one of the things that Jeff said about me being a dedicated resource that kind of had relationships within the organization, you don't know when somebody that you reach out to is going to respond to your request for research. And so especially towards the end, as we had some sessions scheduled, we were trying to align to a certain quota per persona. And so our needs would kind of adjust regularly, right? Like, okay, now we have this persona that responded and they're scheduled, so we actually don't need what we needed yesterday. So then I would go off and message people that I had relationships with and say, thanks for those names yesterday, don't need those anymore. Who's next? Who else do you have that meets this criteria, right? And so it was kind of, especially towards the end, it was a little bit rapid fire, and having those relationships, people that I've worked with in the past that have relationships with customers was really beneficial.
Yeah. And I think one thing, based on the response that we got from individuals and their participation and the benefit to the team, one thing to look to next is this an opportunity to open up a regular panel so that we can always have access to a customer group that we can just put things out to in pieces and get constant feedback on. So kind of a next step that we could be adding on to as future work comes in, or just something to set up as a regular cadence so that we have that access.
Yep.
Bryan, you want to add something before we move on to the next?
No. I was just unmuting myself in preparation for.
Okay, good.
Do you want to kick it off then, Bryan?
Sure. I'm apparently eager. Yeah, so I think, as everyone's probably guessed and from the intros can kind of tell, we had two design teams essentially approaching this project, from the Flexera side and from the IA side. I think that is a super interesting way to approach some of these projects, and at least speaking from the agency side of things, not something that we're always afforded the ability to do with most of the clients that we're working with. Typically, when you're kicking off a project, you're always kind of establishing what that working cadence is going to be and the level of sophistication a particular client might have with the design, especially with non-design led teams. There's always going to be a certain amount of helping them understand the design process, coming to a shared understanding of what the term design even means for that particular client, which, of course, can vary quite a bit. And getting a better understanding of what that team's objectives and roles for the project are going to be. Those are things we didn't have to do in this project, which was a huge advantage just from out of the blocks. The Flexera team all being designers as well. We were really able to focus on the work specifically, and essentially would be able to lean on each other as we were kind of going through the work. But there are still some things that are important to define through that process when you're considering what that working cadence actually looks like, mainly, with the client and the agency, or the in-house and the agency both having, similar backgrounds, similar experiences. How do you really define those roles and the difference between it? How are you delineating between the responsibilities that I would have as a UX designer versus Ashley? But I think where the success came in this particular project is being able to essentially leverage our backgrounds as UX designers or designers in general, in different ways for this. Coming from in-house, Ian, Niketa, Ashley, they all had the kind of expertise and domain knowledge to really help us sharpen and refine the concepts that we were bringing into it, which is a fantastic, thing that, we're able to lean on them, because it's not just, a business analyst or, a product person giving you a lot of requirements, but, there's strong backing in design as a rationale for some of the decisions and input that are being made into any of the things that we're creating. On the other side of that coin, though, on the agency side, it's our job as kind of the fresh eyes in this process to really make sure that we're not getting too far into the weeds or approaching the problems with the same kind of preconceived notions or ideas that someone who is actually in-house might have, because the Flexera team has been sitting with this project or with this space for years and years in some cases, and so being able to come and change perspectives in some cases and suggest alternate ways of approaching the problem hopefully proved to be beneficial in some cases.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I wanted to talk about for this topic, Bryan, because for me, this was a learning experience. No, it was a great lead-in, right? Because for me, it was a learning experience. So as part of, we kind of wrapped this up with an innovation week where we did a whole bunch of concepts and ideas and screens and validated, went back, iterated, and then validated again. And for that week, I worked with Hyun. on our concepts. And we would have our meeting and come up with a plan and say, okay, you go off and do these ones, I'll go off and do these ones, and we'll connect in a couple hours. Well, after that couple hours, Hyun would have significantly more screens than me, and I'd kind of be like, what? Why is he so much faster, right? Like, what the heck? What happened? And what I realized is that my domain knowledge actually became a hindrance to me, whereas Hyun didn't have that domain knowledge, so he was able to focus on the idea and iterate a little bit faster and get out more ideas and concepts that we could work with and validate with our personas. Whereas for me, right, I would be in my head and I'd be like, well, if I don't do this, then this stakeholder is going to ask this, or this stakeholder is going to ask this. And I was anticipating the feedback a little bit more. And I would go deeper into the problem because I had that domain knowledge. And so I would try and solve it to the nth degree and make it more ideal than just a concept. And the whole goal was to have the concepts. And so for me, it really was a learning experience. And I learned from Hyun in that sense. And so I, of course, hope to carry that forward more in the initial phases of my designs.
Yeah, there's a benefit in the ignorance.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was frustrating for me to have Hyun have so many more screens than me. I was like, what the heck? Like, why am I so slow, right? And I came to that realization. It's not that I'm slow, it's that I'm getting stuck in my head.
Well, I think that was my objective, right? When we had at the beginning, when I talked about the vision, the couple of vision was to definitely have Flexera create a North Star, but also inspire our internal teams to see how others are doing it and how we can inspire them to do it better. So goal achieved.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think just getting into the specifics of that innovation week, and to set a little context, essentially it was, a dedicated week where we were pairing IA and Flexera designers together with stakeholders to, as Ashley said, just generate a number of different concepts that could be pushed forward and into the roadmap. But I think, the way that ended up being very successful was in creating those multi-team or those multidisciplinary and IA and Flexera teams, essentially, where you were with Hyun, I was working with Ian. Like, we were able to approach the same problems that we were trying to solve through two very different perspectives, where I think that's where we not only were able to create a lot of concepts very quickly as a result of it, because that's the goal of it, but we were able to lean on Flexera in that to get a lot more specificity to them than like IA ever could have done in that amount of time had we gone back to our remote offices and just went heads down for a week. We were able to essentially try things out, immediately get feedback. Essentially I could show something to Ian, like in the morning, he would tell me, you're wrong for these 6 different reasons. And by lunchtime, we have a much more salable kind of design. So I think it, really expedited the process to get to, not something that we're going to put code to immediately, but certainly something that could hopefully rally the company around the potential solutions that we were really looking at.
Yeah, and I think just for context, the other level of validation that we had was IA Collaborative working with a Flexera designer, but then I don't even know, it might have been 2 or 3 rounds with stakeholders, right? So we'd come up with an initial idea amongst ourselves, then go to the stakeholders, do it again based on their feedback, do it again based on their feedback. And so that was kind of a beneficial learning experience for everyone as well.
So that concludes our process. We just wanted to open it up, Lon, for any question answers. We can actually help. I know that we didn't bring a lot of artifacts to kind of show, the reason being it's confidential, so we can't really show too much, but we wanted to share with everyone our experience on how we kind of created a process which worked for both the parties and how audience can benefit.
Yeah, that is a great presentation. I think that you guys dove into a lot of detail in terms of the relationship and how it was built. And certainly anyone's feel free to type question into the chat. I'll ask a question to kind of kick off, as you guys read some of the questions that have been posted already, so from an agency side, I'm curious, this big picture, this is a B2B software product that is servicing a very niche audience. So from an agency perspective, some people are asking questions about the process. Was it any different? Did you outline different steps than you would have with, let's say, a consumer-oriented product or service that you work on? So how does that differ maybe from the challenges that you faced with Flexera?
I think overall, B2B space is a lot more complex than B2C space. Maybe I'm being biased, but I do think that B2B has so much complexity on their technology. There's so much complexity on the legacy. I came from GE as well, so I know that was also B2B, and it's just the amount of stakeholders you have, amount of personas, amount of screens you have. It's different than B2C experience. I do think that some of the UX principles, which as a professionals, which we kind of go through, B2B requires a different type of skill sets than you would require for B2C. For example, when I led at Here Technology, I was leading more of a B2C applications. In that case, we were doing more research on A/B testing on the live environment, for example. So that required me to hire a researcher who has experience on that case. But when I came to GE and Flexera, it was more on the B2B side, where there was no necessary live A/B testing. You could do A/B testing without having it live, but now you completely have a different ballgame, because now B2C has external facing, and you can do a lot of testing live, and in here you don't have to necessarily do live. But in addition to that, B2B as an enterprise, as a company, you have they've put stakes on, right? B2B as a company, Flexera or GE, they have a ton of stakes into their products, versus B2C applications have a lot more stakes, not only in the product, but other artifacts and assets as well. So that's kind of a difference I see in the organization and how they budget, how they put their resources, and how they actually go into the market. So those are the main differences I see. Anybody else?
I was just going to add one point to that. I think when you're looking at B2B compared to B2C, there's, just an interesting context that you have to consider a lot of the approach can be very similar, but the way that you analyze some of the learnings and insights varies a little bit. Just the key difference being that, when you're dealing with B2B, typically the end users aren't necessarily the customer. So there's always going to be, an interesting way to evaluate and structure some of the decisions that are being made throughout that, where you really need to take into consideration some of the more enterprise level needs that the individual customers that you're speaking to, or the individual users you're speaking to, might not always have a full picture of, especially when you're looking at a larger scale project or product. An individual user might have just a very small glimpse into the complete product itself, and so they typically aren't looking at the holistic nature of essentially the enterprise software.
Yeah, one other small build I might have is, as designers, you're always looking for inspiration or seeing how the competitive landscape does it. And I think for B2B, it's a lot harder to access because you can't just easily sign up for something and experience it from a consumer side. So I think, that's another element too, is you want to look at different benchmarks. And I think B2B is a little bit more challenging than it is B2C.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, when you do look for inspiration, you often find things that are really applicable just to B2C, right? And it doesn't really consider all the nuances of B2B. And that goes for design patterns and things like that, that maybe even aren't specific to the features of B2B. But once you get into the complexity of B2B, that inspiration doesn't take you very far because it's too high level.
Yeah.
I will say that the world is expecting a B2C experience in B2B products now. So like it's, when you're pulling in that inspiration, it's nice to pull over the experiential parts to it.
So we had a question about how you've sort of adapted your collaboration during the pandemic. And I think that, no one, I don't know if anyone on the team here has met each other in person, or it's been limited. Did you guys feel that the project moved at a pace that was sort of similar to what would have gone on without the pandemic?
I mean, for me, there wasn't a whole difference. Sorry, Ian.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, so one, the Flexera team, we're already a mixed remote office pre-pandemic team. And so when we went pandemic, it was actually just easier to get a hold of everybody. Plus we're spread across continents. So for us, I don't know if it really changed how we approach things, but I would say in terms of interacting with our partners at IA, I have a feeling we might have actually gone faster because of it, right? Because it wasn't like, oh, we got to have a client meeting and everybody's got together in a room or whatever. And actually, it was more like, Bryan or Hyun or Sarah or Jeff. It was like a chat away to have a conversation or a question answered. And because we had taken the time early on to get set up and integrate with them, I actually can't think of doing this differently. I can't imagine going down to the agency site and having a conference room and a presentation anymore. Maybe for fun because there might be cocktails afterwards, but but in general, no. For us, I think it was actually not an impact.
I think it comes down to the tools that you use too, right? Like we used Mural, which is very interactive. You can get in there all at once and interact with each other. Figma, someone mentioned in another part, that's also really interactive. So there's plenty of tools to help support that, where it doesn't really impact the collaboration. I mean, it's always a little better to be in the room with people having a face-to-face conversation, but now that we have video and we've all kind of gotten so used to it over the past year, it's not much different from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. A great question from Sonia for any tips on a project that she's working on right now, trying to form that sort of North Star.
Yeah, it's a good question.
A lot of tips. I think you definitely can follow up process here, the one which we've described. I don't know, Sonia, if you're working with the agency or not. Regardless of agency is just part of the team, but regardless of that, creating a North Star is not easy. But I would highly recommend that this process would really help you. Start with research. I think getting the customers to tell you exactly how the North Star should be. I mean, in many of our research sessions, that someone would actually describe our North Star, which is, again, kind of fantastic, right? To have customers describe it. I actually took the customer's clip and showed it to all the stakeholders, like, look how customer is describing our North Star. And that got me a lot of buy-in to saying, yes, we can do this and we can do this. So research is extremely important. And of course, the user journey mapping, and if you can actually do that, that would help you. Competitive review, usually B2B companies are usually focused on a lot of competition. So if you can actually pull any competitive reviews and tell them that this is how others are doing it, you will gain market share. So one of the things as a leader, I have to show a lot of ROIs for all the North Stars. So hey, how am I going to get the benefit out of this? So that was one of the challenging one. So I would rely on potentially a usability score or an NPS score, and I rely on revenue and how much of that revenue could be factored into the UX contribution of showing the North Star. So I don't know, giving a lot of tips in here. I don't know if it answers your question, but if you have anything specific, feel free to reach out to any of us on LinkedIn.
One thing I'll add, and I don't know if you're, like you said, I don't know if you're working with an agency or just an internal project, but for us, part of the project was finding out what that North Star was, but you can't do that without tying it back to the business. And so at Flexera, we have a series of strategic initiatives each year that they set out. And so when I am, or Ashley or Niketa, when we're working with the team on what the research is going to be, what the moderation guides are going to look like, we are evaluating each one of those questions to see, do they help us steer toward what's something that's going to achieve our strategic initiatives, or are they noise, right? And so at each point along the way, we would make modifications to how we would, either how we look at something, how we'd write a moderation guide, or how we might interject or inject questions into the conversation, in order to get at those things that we're looking for to help us pull those levers and make sure those initiatives for the company are met, right? And that goes directly back to our ROI, because anything we can do for those as our business drivers, right? And if you want to make headway in an organization, especially one that not everybody gets UX, you can point to those strategic initiatives and say, look, here's how we support X, Y, and Z. You'll move a lot faster in terms of being able to get what you need implemented.
Yeah, and I think a big part of understanding those initiatives is talking to senior leadership in your organization, because the initiative on paper is one thing, but the initiative in everyone's head is a little bit different. Everyone's going to have a little bit different understanding of it and a little bit different perspective depending on what their specific goals are. So that goes for sales, marketing, product managers, engineering, right? How they achieve that initiative is different. The other thing that you'll get from interviewing all of these stakeholders is an understanding of, okay, does what my customers need and want, what my users need and want, align to what these stakeholders need and want? Or do I need to spend a little bit more time trying to tie these two together and probably convincing my stakeholder that, hey, this is actually what our users need and want to be successful? Do I need to build that story a little bit better for them?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think for the most part, it's I think establishing a North Star or an MVP or vision, it's basically a negotiation between all the different criteria that you're considering, right? So you're thinking about your pure business objectives, you're thinking about competitive differentiation, you're thinking about kind of what your brand positioning is, you're thinking about technology. There's like all these criteria that you're looking at, and it's looking at those. Essentially looking at what your objectives are and trying to, do the negotiations. Like, we could do this, but there are trade-offs. If you go one direction, you're going to sacrifice another way. So really thinking about the different lenses that you're using for your consideration set, and then driving kind of the discussions around that. So I think that's kind of like really what happens when, especially in digital product and things like that, when you're trying to figure out what is that vision, what is that MVP. We go into those types of discussions. I mean, and it really just depends. I think there's more than obviously one way to do it. Like, just really super easy tactical stuff that we've done before is like even, writing that press release. We have a lot of times when we're working like way in the beginning, we just want to pull that out from the beginning, because lots of times people will just have this idea in their head and they're just hoping it'll be said. And then later on in the project, if it's not met, then they'll come out and say it. So just pulling that stuff out just right from the get-go, getting those ideas out, and then, writing that press release just to articulate it and getting it down on paper, I think is sometimes helpful as well.
Yeah, our CEO actually really likes that approach of the kind of fictitious press release, or the press release in 2 years in the future. One other thing that I would add about kind of forming your North Star is don't get distracted. It's going to be so easy to get distracted by others in your organization. Maybe this salesperson has a sale on the line and they want this specific feature for that sale. That's great and fine if that's what the company chooses to do, but it's probably not your North Star, right? And so there's a lot of distractions like that can come into play. Maybe engineering has their own initiative to modernize some technology, but maybe that doesn't go towards the North Star. So really rely on those stakeholder interviews and customer research to build that North Star, and try not to get distracted while you're doing it.
And build a relationship in the organization. Some of the stakeholders are going to help you to get to your North Star. So cross-functional organization is going to help you push that. So product management, engineering, architecture, marketing, sales, build those relationships in order to move it forward.
Okay.
Lon, back to you.
Great. Any additional questions? I do not see any. Give it a minute. But this has been terrific. I don't think we have any additional questions, so I want to thank everyone for joining tonight and having this fantastic discussion. I really believe that it helps sort of educate folks on kind of the inner workings of how the relationship can work, all the time that needs to be put in, the documentation and the process. Because in this case, it sounds like it really did pay off in a major way to have that deep collaboration among the teams. So again, we really appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining. We look forward to everyone participating in future events, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thanks, Lon. Thanks for hosting us.
Thank you, Lon. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Hopefully it was helpful.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Take care, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks so
IA.
much, guys.
Good
Take
working
care.
with you.
Hey, guys.